I mean, maybe I sort of lead slightly onto. I did want to sort of bring up the sort of conflict that might exist between the local and the international. We started to touch on it earlier and sort of digress slightly, but there's the conflict between the local and the international in the narrative of contemporary architectural design. You spoke about how there was a sort of problem in Doha, and actually they wanted the design to sort of be more Qatari, yet actually because it was being produced by people that had never visited the site and maybe had kind of more Western influence, and suddenly there appears to be this potential conflict between that. How do you represent the local and market to the international, essentially, when producing designs like this. And I think, with that comes potential issues where, there might become like an erasure of anything that might be sort of deemed undesirable. One site of development that I came across, which I did a project about, was at the Cass School of Art, which is being redeveloped and relocated away from that building. And one of, looking at the sort of planning documents for what the building was going to become, they talked about the sort of socially undesirable, was the phrase that they use, area around the outskirts in Whitechapel. And so what does it mean to start to then, what does that even mean for the start of that? And then if that is then that information is then given to a visualising, how do you start to how do you deal with these ideas around local and international? I think that's what I wanted to speak about as well.
Well, I think the Qatari situation is, was quite unique in some ways. Firstly, because it was, there was a huge amount of money invested in that project. Obviously, it was in Qatar, but also a huge amount of investment in doing research and so on that preceded the development project. So for 3 years they were researching what is the Qatari vernacular, and building up a body of knowledge about Qatari cultural heritage and architecture. And that really provided the foundations for the design approach to that whole scheme. I think the issue with the local and the global was something that was not just a sort of simple result of the fact that it was mainly UK and American architects working on it, but also because the Qataris themselves, have quite a cosmopolitan sensibility. Qataris are, as we were told, they're wealthy, the very small Qatari minority of the population. They're well-travelled, and actually the Qatari imaginary is made up of many different places around the world, and they take that back to Qatar, and that sort of fed certain expectations into the project. So there was this sort of dual kind of desire to both build on the Qatari past, construct an idea of a sort of distinct Qatari identity and heritage that is different from Emirati or other parts of the region, Saudi identity, but also reflect this cosmopolitan modernity that Qataris relish, and work out how to translate this into a sort of set of design codes and a new kind of what do they call it? A sort of new kind of Doha for that site, and a sort of model that would provide an alternative approach to development from what had been done in Dubai and again elsewhere in the region, and also sort of push back against that whole history of Western modernisation in the 1950s and 60s to establish a different model. So it's a quite complex coming together of different sort of motivations and aspirations, and one that is very much about embedding a particular kind of city in a wider international cosmopolitan context as part of a network of cities.
I mean, I have to say that actually one of the title World Capital wasn't entirely mine, and I did take it from the description of in the marketing material for this London City Island development. They describe London as a world capital, and I think that's exactly what you're talking of, is cities that market themselves as international, as places, you know, that are cosmopolitan and that are essentially world capitals.
The thing about this being the location, you know, down the road you've got plaques commemorating the East India Company, and, you know, the various kind of, in the docks are very significant in the growth of that kind of mercantile capitalism and the establishment of those global economic structures. The things set out from here, you know, there's an engine of, you know, colonisation, imperialism that sets out from here, and it's that resource extraction and brings it all back. And now that's kind of enfolded back into the site, and in the kind of nostalgifying of all those signifiers, and kind of almost like cleansing of some of them, in the sense of, oh, let's play games with the symbolism without really thinking deeply about what it means. You know, like Good Luck Hope over the road, the title itself is really significant. You know, this idea that you might invest in a ship that goes forth into some colonial, far-flung part of the world that you don't even have a grasp on, and it's going to come back and make you wealthy. You know, and this idea of speculation on the voyage is all part of this mythology which has been loaded into this area. It's absolutely fascinating.
And because of course nostalgia is or capital is so tied to nostalgia as well.
There's such a dense network of talking. You spend hours unpicking that stuff, you know, the links between, you know, power, colonialism, the links between colonialism and capitalism in the context of this area. You know, I think there's a lot of thought going on at the moment into, you know, that deep interweaving of colonial enterprise and capitalism and how it kind of manifested itself. But here you've got all sorts of things where you can actually almost point to it and smell it and see it and touch it. But there's efforts going on to conceal it or to gamify it or to make it, or to aestheticize it in the sense that you don't think too much about what you're really playing with. And there's something in which all these images serve towards the creation of a subject which is almost kind of blind to these signifiers. They're invested in the image to such an extent that they can't, that if they were ever to really understand what was going on behind those images, then suddenly they'd find themselves kind of destitute in some way and wouldn't be able to participate in that system. I think that the digital image as I see it, and these things, I mean, it comes back to the thing about, you know, don't be too critical of it. It has its good sides, but I think it's part of
not critical, cynical.
Cynical is the word you use.
I think
cynical.
Can be very critical.
We can be very critical. Cynical is the word you used, absolutely. But this idea that it has to generate belief, you know, if you lose that belief, or if you are too, if you're able to ignore certain things about it, you benefit financially, economically, culturally, socially.
And that idea of belief is so tied up in surface again, as well as the surface of the image. It's the sort of it's the narrative that sort of what we perceive from it.
Yeah, and that's where the effect comes in as well. You know, you don't just believe in it with your mind; you believe in it with your heart. You immerse yourself in it. You feel it. You know, you feel that faith in it, like you want to be there. You want to dream yourself into that space. Never mind its dark tendrils and deep roots.
I come to this more from an urban development point of view, I guess, and I don't know this area at all. That's why I wanted to come today, so I don't claim any knowledge. But I do know a lot about Barcelona, for example, and my work there. I don't know, I'm not clear yet about what exactly I think, but there's also, like, okay, we have CGIs, we have a global discourse and policy discourse that replicates urban redevelopment models through CGIs nowadays, etc. But I believe in the local, that it also reappropriates this kind of global imposition. And that's what I've seen very much in my research, you know, in Spain, but also in Milton Keynes, Bedford, etc., that despite these global, you know, top-down kind of redevelopment procedures with similar surfaces, etc., the local, I wouldn't call it subversion, but reappropriates often these spaces, and the CGI image will never happen exactly that way, not even here. And you know, just walking around before with Claire, you know, there were all kind of different people using this space in different ways, including some porters that were, I don't know, preparing, I don't know, well, things you wouldn't expect, sorry, but porters passing by with big, what were these things they were carrying, these two men? Like for a party, I don't know.
I don't know what they were.
Yeah, well, however, what I'm trying to say is that the local practices, even if they're not local, these might be tourists, I don't know who these people are, etc. But you know, it's constantly renegotiated, let's put it that way. And I don't know, again, I think, you know, that there is different spaces opening up.
Well, the things opening up and things are closing down. If you look at, you know, going back to, you know, the development of docklands, one of the things that Sue Brownhill writes about in developing docklands is the inequality of power at the representational level between the people who are developing docklands and creating, you know, visions of Canary Wharf and the Isle of Dogs as would be, and vast amounts of money. This is pre-rendering, you know, going to, you know, models and designs of the city that were presented in the context of investment, and just trying to battle on the level of the image for docklands. And those community groups and those local organisations that try to push back just didn't have the resources to create images which were strong enough to, or had reach. You know, there were obviously, you know, things like the billboard campaigns and, you know, all the kind of fight back against the LDDA. Reached the art schools, reached the Guardian, blah, 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 blah. It didn't, you know, whereas the other stuff just had such massive reach.
Yeah.
So there's between the local and let's say the powerful, let's not say the global, that there is that inequality on the level of the production of images and the way in which they're sent forth into the world. And that was really pertinent here on the site that we're on. I mean, obviously, as Nimrod points out, not quite this site, because it was a bunch of derelict factories for a long time, but there was still labour here. I think that they were still, even if it wasn't a residential space, the community worked here. Yeah. It's not that they were resident here, but it's still a space which was inhabited.
Well, I mean, I think there's maybe a sense that, you know, these kind of sites can never erase the local, but it's more as a sort of redefining of, and you know, there's a constant kind of redefining of what, of what local might be. And I particularly, I know it's quite interesting in what Monica was saying about, you know, about actually, you know, for example, you see things that you wouldn't necessarily expect. You say perhaps, you know, the porter carrying something, you wouldn't, you know, just these sort of, I guess like slippages or moments of interruption that maybe you wouldn't necessarily imagine sort of coming across. And in reflection of, you know, I suppose a very intense week or so spent here producing this exhibition, kind of getting to know the island and spending a lot of time here. And there were moments like that I noticed, and perhaps moments that were brought on myself as well, being here and making this, and that, you know, that wasn't in the rendered image that imagined it. So, you know, a moment of me standing outside, sort of quite heavily pregnant in a gas mask, melting acrylic, and it's you know, this isn't something that would have been included in the rendered image that imagined this space.
No, I think you can download that one now.
yeah, exactly. I'll make
Someone's done that
it. Or, you know, or even trying to sort of negotiate a taxi here because of, you know, somebody I was working with cut his finger open on, you know, so there were these kind of moments of. There were moments of interruption. And and I think as an artist as well, like maybe going back to that question that I asked earlier about how do we, you know, not necessarily how do we become activists, because that isn't necessarily our end goal, but how do we interrupt or participate in or intrude somehow within these spaces or within the space of the computer-generated image, especially when they sort of exist on screen and then that's sort of translated to surface. You know, where is the potential? And then maybe it might be good to sort of go back to that, because also you just brought up the kind of the posters around that were produced in the 80s around sort of Docklands redevelopment, and these kind of quite amazing sort of, they were like billboard campaigns.
Oh yeah, it was really quite famous.
And it's like, you know, what role did they play, or like, you know, what role, if I think about a project I made last year in Toronto where the work inhabited a huge sort of 10 by 10 metre kind of billboard space, which is commonly used to it was in downtown Toronto, which is a site huge kind of urban redevelopment and kind of condo production, and this kind of speculative future that I created was placed within that environment. But then what does that really do? Does it really really
and I think it's very important. I think Adam and I might disagree on that. But I'm not pro redevelopment, etc. But I think as a sociologist, I'm also interested. Okay, there are these mega power structures, but once places happen, what actually develops there, and what I find I don't want to just judge all these people living in these new developments and say they live in these banal places and you're having banal lives, which etc. I think what I find interesting is to look at, like you mentioned, the interactions that happen, and how also maybe I don't know, again, I can't speak about London, but the areas I looked at in Barcelona, the redevelopment wasn't done the right way, yes, but the people, the original inhabitants, which again, who are the original inhabitants? Because, people keep changing, but they lived in places with no running water, etc., and there wasn't a golden path there either, like this close-knit community needed, there needed to be some kind of redevelopment, although the way they did it was wrong. And I don't know about London whether it was similar, that something had to happen, but the way it was implemented, of course, wasn't, the right way, and it didn't include the local community. However, once it happens, I also think there's a danger of always, wiping everybody with the same cloth, or whatever you say. I don't know, and I'm a bit, I would like to more, I don't know, question that a bit more, and that's why I also brought up the historical question about surfaces and fashions and trends in architecture. It's very easy to constantly criticize the present, and there is a lot to criticize, don't get me wrong, but, are there also other perspectives? I don't know.
I think it's really important to have that sort of counter argument, because it's also very easy to enter a space that we don't live in and be critical of it. Exactly like you say, isn't this banal, and actually isn't this just like every other site of redevelopment, and actually what who is this really for? But, and I think I was saying to you earlier that when I was here installing the show over Easter, it was there were families to playing with children outside. The space was absolutely occupied, and it seemed. Actually, it did kind of seem like the rendered image that imagined this space. It was, it wasn't like perhaps some sites of development which are purely investments and nobody lives in them, and they sort of end up being these kind of ghost towns. It feels very lived in. And I remember the first time that I visited here, I kind of walked past the clubhouse, which is of course again another kind of common feature in these kind of developments, and there were people playing ping pong and sort of table football and drinking and looking, wearing really nice clothes, and it was it again really very much looked like that image.
You can't tell what the relationship is between those two people playing ping pong. No. It's the question about what can be communicated through the visual. I think that's one of the key things to take away from this exhibition and some of these things is, this is a relevant point really, I guess, is, the visual will only take you so far. If you rely on that, you're just making a whole load of assumptions that what you see is some kind of reality. And those two people playing ping pong might involved in a tremendous conflict of wills on some other level you barely grasp, but to you just think, this looks cool, this will do in a rendering. The more we come to rely on these images, community is something that you almost can't photograph. And those kind of interhuman relationships where they really matter, they're told through they're expressed through different things, and they can be told in many different ways, but very rarely can they be meaningfully expressed through the visual, because the visual will actually conceal certain temporalities or complexities in the relationships between people, as we know too well, from teaching students,
absolutely.
what the image conceals.
Yeah. It's actually an interesting word that you bring up as community, I think, as well, especially in relation to us talking about kind of that conflict between the local and the international and what that kind of really means. And I think community is definitely a word that's come up for me when, not just in this site, but actually kind of looking at other sites of redevelopment, because it's a word that's used in marketing. This is a new community. How can it be a new? It's a new community. Are you sort of curating some kind of community by choosing somebody who lives there? Like what do we mean by this, and what sort of what opportunities are there to build community in a place like this? Again, kind of maybe going back to a sort of more critical aspect. I think about even the sort of use of facilities being dictated by whether you are living in a flat that you privately own, that you bought, or whether you're living in a sort of social housing part of the of the development. There are things. Everything isn't for everybody. So how do you build community out of that? I think about recently this. I forget the development now, but a new development in London where there's a playing field for children whose parents own flats, and there's a playing field for children that are in social housing. What does that?
We live just up the road in Royal Docks area, and one thing that a few years into living there, we saw and covered some documents that revealed that actually the way in which our area was zoned was there was literally a dividing wall with gateways to separate the privately owned properties from those which were social housing. And we kind of lived on the sort of social housing side in the project. It was a Gordon Brown project for developing social homes for like £50,000. This was back in 2005. The other side, there was this wall. We used to walk past it to go to the shops. And only after reading this paper we realised that it was specifically put there. The developers would not agree to develop that area unless there was a physical divide between the two different economic groups in the area. The significant is Ireland here as well. There's something about the British way in which they envisage planning. There's this idea of exclusivity. And all, the language of that, community on the one hand, but exclusive community, you hear all this kind of words bandied around. And there is a certain sense in which this is, it does have a moat around it.
That's deeply embedded in the history of London's development.
Oh my God,
you can't sort of pretend that that's anything new.
No, you can't. No, it's nothing new at all. Hideous things happen, yes.
I wonder whether it might be a good time to open up to the audience, and if anyone's got any questions, because we still have time to kind of continue the discussion, but I think I've gone through my questions, and I imagine that some of you might have some more interesting ones. So if anyone wants to begin,
I am trained as a landscape architect. My career has been in urban context, and I've done a lot of master planning and implemented design projects internationally. And I think that, and I'm actually from California, you can tell I'm not. There are a number of really important issues that have been brought up here, and economics and social aspects or whatever. But to dig down beyond what is being represented in imagery, in computer-generated imagery to the public, to back up as a design professional, I see that so much of the issue here goes back to the design process. And it has to, when I read here, and then it's been mentioned a couple of times in your discussion about how these people in Doha are doing all this work that they've never even been to the site. And I'm just appalled by that. I would never have practiced that way in my career. You go to a place, you understand it, you research, you do history, you community, you talk to the people, you have community outreach, you bring those users in to that process. And you hopefully have a sensitive design team of all the disciplines that need to be a part of it, and a client that cares about creating a place, an appropriate place, and you hope that you've got economics behind that project that are going to enable it to be built with some longevity, whatever that means in this culture at this day and age. But so I think that to blame too much on computer-generated imagery is way too simplistic. That it's much more complex than that, and yes, a client group may be projecting something that's not accurate or maybe false or whatever. But I think if there's an honesty to that process and the work that really needs to be done, we can create better places. We're not necessarily doing it for a lot of reasons, but I think that it really has to do with a much earlier phase of the process than that imagery.
Well, I think, just to clarify with the Doha project, the lead partners were travelling to Doha, but the problem is that the people who are actually doing the day-to-day work of making, technical drawings and visualizations are not. And that's the same in any practice, that you've got the workforce in the office who are...
Yeah, there's a certain amount of collaboration, whatever, that has to occur in that design process. So you don't have the big thinkers over here, and then you've got the minions over here, and there's not that understanding of collaboration, so that the minions don't really understand what it is they're translating out of the gurus, at the top. It's very complicated. There's
But again, I think this is a sort of aspect of the scaling up of architectural practice. So now we see these huge firms working on projects, and similarly, working on projects of a much bigger scale than we've ever done. And I suppose that's something I was going to mention in relation to, CGIs as a technology, that they go hand in hand with this acceleration and scaling up of architectural development. So these developments are produced so fast now, and that is a huge difference from how, development has been done in the past, and leads to certain, sort of effects in terms of its materialization. This was something that came up over and over again with the Doha project, the incredible pace that it had to be, was conducted at. So again, it's a complex situation with many different sort of aspects.
I had a comment and then a question. The comment has to do with the Georgian Victorian point that you brought up. Most of that housing stock was built to rent. And if you're a corporation or a council building to rent, it makes sense to build it really well.
Yeah.
Not good materials, otherwise you're going to have to keep repairing it. If you build for sale, corners are going to be cut. The interesting developments which are a mixture of rental and owner-occupier are producing a lot of tension around this, because on the one hand you've got an impetus, a cynical impetus, to make all of your profit and cut corners on materials, but the rental impetus is very different. We actually want to better domestic architecture. We should actually move to a rental. And this is a chilling question, because everyone wants to own a Victorian or Georgian house. Still. And they're still around, and they're still very flexible. They're 120, 160 years old. Nothing outside this door is going to be around.
But that's linked to things like the gutting of pensions and benefits, isn't it? That people have to have the property now because that's their capital, that's what they can own, and that's what they're going to, what I mean?
The bottom line is the bottom line. If you're going to build to sell, it's going to be shit, unless it's blue chip development. Question is to do with architectural modernism and photography of the 20s and 30s, because this still, both photography in one way and also architecture, we're still living with the ground covered and the developments made in the 20s and 30s. I mean, arguably, we wouldn't have had an international style in architecture if there wasn't already a kind of complicit relationship between the built form and images. Also, I'd like to hear from Felicity actually, because sitting in this installation, it doesn't feel remotely contemporary to me. It feels like it's got a very strong relation to 20s, 30s avant-garde film, theatre. This feels like Metropolis. There's a bit of German expressionism, there's a bit of Soviet constructivism, there's a kind of weird Art Nouveau colour palette to the whole thing. And I wonder if those are connected, this idea of photographic modernism and
I mean, it's
the
definitely.
avant-garde theatre thing.
I mean, I think in terms of perhaps not necessarily my most sort of relevant and recent research in what we spoke about today, that is perhaps something separate, but absolutely the kind of construction of sort of urban environments through film and through photography have massively influenced the way that I kind of construct images. And yeah, I'm absolutely right, Metropolis, I mean, the machine of the building, or the way that within that film there's this sort of underworld and the relationship it has with labour. And so much of my interest in the representation of the built environment has to do with the representation of industry, perhaps at a time where I wasn't able to experience it. It's a time where my family were able to, sort of older, my father's generation or grandfather's generation. But I guess there's a sense of nostalgia in the work because there's also I'm dealing with a sense of loss as well, and loss in the landscape. The things that we talk about, I sort of mentioned with the locus, it's not really erased, it's redefined, but actually. Perhaps to contradict that, I mean, I think there are areas that have been erased, and actually there's sort of industrial, or sort of the industrial landscape that I perhaps have quite a romantic thought of or relationship with. That's what sort of disappeared, and I think there's a constant trying to kind of re-access that through my practice. But also, and in terms of sort of aesthetics as well, you sort of mentioned the kind of Art Nouveau colour palette. Actually, I understand that reference, but for me the colour palette really comes from thinking about the blueprint, the architectural blueprint, but also the cyanotype, and also the kind of sun-kissed, sun-faded image, thinking about its relationship with printed digital imagery, what happens when actually that imagery is sort of left and discarded and becomes sun-faded. So thinking about how the image might reflect that actually these buildings aren't made to last, and neither is the kind of physical quality of the printed image as well. So it's absolutely very tied up in photographic representation as well.
I might be showing my age, but it feels like a kind of 80s version of the 20s. Well, there's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interest. Well, first of all, Metropolis was colorized and re-released in the late 80s with Freddie Mercury's soundtrack, if I recall. And it was kind of toned, and there was this kind of issue about what you should be doing with these older images and how they might live on. Meanwhile, British graphic design is obsessed with the 20s avant-garde. It feels a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think those observations, even if kind of subtly, or that kind of those reference points that I'd say they're more kind of seeped into the practice as opposed to necessarily being kind of the focus of it. But I think that's through, even thinking about the relationship between the very kind of staging of the computer-generated image and these kind of speculative images that we're seeing, that the fact that they become sets that somebody is going to inhabit. So I think the very set-like quality of it is something that I wanted to address in the construction of the work.
On that subject of the erasure of industry, it occurred to me that one thing the CGI rendering does, especially in the sort of the films that you see on developers' websites, is that it shows the building of these sites without the industry that's involved, without the labour that's involved.
Mhm.
And it shows them sort of springing up organically almost.
Mhm.
Or sometimes there's like a, what's it called, where you've got to speed it up.
Time-lapse thing, yeah.
Time-lapse, yeah, time-lapse photography of, and these things happen like in a few minutes. They
Yeah.
go from a building site to a finished thing. But quite often it's a very weird, freaky, organic kind of development. Like on City Island, before this was developed, there was film of it as sort of all these red and blue Lego bricks flying through the air, coming together in blocks, and then they sort of peeled away to reveal a building underneath, all of their own accord, no human or mechanical industry involved. And I find that really interesting in contributing to this fantasy of there is no work, there's no actual labour involved in creating these places. And I wonder who that fantasy is, where it's coming from, and who it's aimed at.
Yeah.
And, you know, what that's about. That's my question.
I mean, maybe I'll begin, but when, as soon as you said that, I suddenly felt this pang of, actually, what am I talking about, the erasure of industry? I mean, there is an industry, it's just a different industry. It's an erasure of an industry that perhaps I have that I sort of sense a relationship with. But of course, there are builders here every day producing this and making it happen. And I think there's a desire to erase that from the images that imagine it, because again it's a bit like, I guess I think it's sort of saying, use this word of magic, or there's a sort of you're being sold this sort of idea of kind of magic or fantasy, and actually a sort of bunch of builders kind of and materials and concrete and wheelbarrows, it doesn't fit into that. And when you walk on, I don't know if it's still there, but when you walk onto the island from the station, there's a big sign on the door saying no muddy boots allowed indoors, and there are all these kind of little kind of aspects which sort of, even within the physical building of the island itself, it's like, but we kind of don't want to, we don't want that to be there. And when I was installing the work, we had a white van parked around the back, and because the director of Ballymore was coming to visit the development at that point, and said, you've got to move this van, because that's not part of again that is so tied up with sort of labour and production. It's like, the Porsches can stay, but that has to go.
And the residents in the CGI representation are always shown at leisure. Or they're shown, I mean, one other thing that I think is interesting is quite often they're shown on their balconies. Everyone's got a balcony, and they're looking out from their balcony, like in this sort of panoptical fantasy. They're looking at the world from a height, on the balcony. Or sometimes you see the interiors, which are always depicted in the CGI rendering, and they're always empty, but quite often they feature a big telescope.
I kind of wrote about something like this in the Highbury Stadium development. They read about the Arsenal Stadium up in Highbury, and they turned that into flats. And I wrote a bit about the renderings of this, and the idea that the stands where the fans once sat with and watched the players on the pitch were now these kind of places where they stood and watched each other through these plate glass windows, and watched who was actually walking in the kind of parterre garden downstairs. So the kind of visuality of the stadium translated to this idea where this it was a rendering of a space in which redevelopment had turned into this network of observation, like the panopticon's got somebody in the middle who you're scared is going to see. But this was everybody was the person in the middle.
But again, I mean, it's very much the idea of, there are two things. It's sort of the city as a kind of consumer product that you buy perfectly finished, ready-made. You don't see anything of the production process behind it. But it's also this, idea of a visual landscape that's laid out. But again, we could argue that, it goes back to capability Brown or whatever. Except that we see these figures placed in it. And there's also the fact that figures are, of course, very, very difficult to deal with in CGIs, and so they're generally just doing something quite sort of straightforward, like standing or sitting.
I like that work by James Bridle, where he goes back to that town in the Midwest where he finds the town where all the people who are competent in photographs comes from, which is great. But going back to capability, right? Going back to to talk about the picturesque, there's a great thing in that Frederick to Fieri, where he talks about the picturesque as where it all kind of kicks off, where you have a regime of landscape design and a regime of representation. So you make the world look like pictures, and then you make pictures that look like the world, and it's that's the origin of this cyclical system where what's built and what's represented, the wheels start turning. So we're making things in order to make them look like images, and we're making images to make them. So he dates it back to the picturesque, which I thought was fascinating.
And I'm coming back to the people.
The people.
Yeah,
Sorry.
because I just thought when you were talking, I had who is the audience on my notes as well, and the audience has become much more knowledgeable as well. We look at these CGIs and smirk, don't we? And most normal people would do as well. My students, at least a lot of my students, we've become. We're embedded in such a visual culture, and my students' generation even more so. So they've become quite ironic.
Yeah.
To be, I think I might be wrong, but so I think also it is quite interesting to think, who is the audience, and is it a bit like in advertising where CGIs have to now move to a different step to engage us again in a credible way, because we don't believe it anymore. But also, and I know we're focusing on CGI, I think once these places get inhabited, they get inhabited in very different ways and not in a uniform way. And I find that again really interesting, what happens then. I don't know. And that's
Interesting sociology.
yeah, that's why I guess where I'm coming more from. And the Doha project, I really would like if Claire and Gillian want to go back. I think it's almost finished, parts of it, and see how is it really working? Is it like those videos, CGI videos and CGI images, or is there a different thing going on now? I don't know, to be very honest. Yeah.
So any other questions? Yeah.
I guess one of the things digital enables is it becomes easier to share intellectual property.
Yeah.
And you've got the open source movement in software, and I know there's the Wiki House project. But to what extent is this happening in architecture, and you think it will be influential in future, or is it something that does not currently be relevant for whatever reason to this area?
What do you mean? So like to what extent will the images still be relevant in?
Not the image is necessarily the idea you can share the whole design so easily with other architects. Which you might not want to do, but perhaps you can build a business model around that that's different from a conventional architecture one.
Well, that was quite an interesting aspect following that Doha project, because as I said, there were multiple practices working on it. But when it came to producing the visualizations of wide views of the site, the different practices had to hand over their drawings so that these views could be constructed. And some of them were reluctant to do that because of copyright and intellectual ownership, etc. So I don't know whether those issues are going to go away, really. Despite, it seems like a sort of paradoxical scenario that we have the technology to do all this sharing, to facilitate sharing, but at the same time, the way that projects are set up and architects are paid and all the rest of it, the sort of structural conditions mean that that doesn't happen. There are sort of major obstacles. In terms of sort of, we produced an issue of Urban Pamphleteer, open source housing, which was kind of exploring these ideas of how you can provide the tools to enable people to produce their own thing. But again, we have to sort of go back to sort of economic and issues and, land availability and all the other sort of complicated factors that militate against those processes, really.
in some ways.
I think this is a fascinating subject, and I think in the context of this work, it's even, and you're seeing the back of it, so we're seeing we're seeing you in it, and so I think it's fascinating. Well, there's a couple of things. One, I had for many years, I'm an urban designer, and I had for many years an urban design firm. We were trained as architects and landscape architects. It was not a big firm, but we didn't do buildings, and we did very little actual built work. And that occurred to me as, I also am one of those people that was referred to as one who, early in my career, we drew everything. And as the profession moved to digital, I found that when I founded my firm in my mid-career, I couldn't do it. So I relied on others who were much younger than me for the entire history of my firm. And we were preparing digital images, and all of our work, even the production of reports, everything that was done was, of course, digital. But I was not able to do that. I was a designer. And one of the things that happened to me in my career, again, the firm that we had was, we were architects and landscape architects, trained that way. And early on, I came to realize that, well, no, I don't want to, I'm not an architect. I'm an urban designer. What interested me was urban design. And I noticed that all of you pretty much have referred to the architect.
Yeah.
And I came to believe, sort of a criticism of my own profession, that cities are too important to be left to architects.
Yeah.
And the reason why is, and typically we'd have these teams, we assemble these teams when we're doing urban plans, things like what's happened here in the Docklands. In fact, I was involved in some work in the Docklands many years ago. And the architect had a role on the team, but was not leading the team. And some of the things you've been saying here I think are really interesting, that different people have said here. But one of the things that I've come to believe, and I still believe is true, is that architecture tends to be an object-oriented, kind of solitary profession. And this is why we see some of the Gherkin and various buildings we're building cities out of object-oriented buildings. The international style and the modernist movement was essentially that. Where buildings are a pristine thing, and they're also driven by, they have a constraint that makes it a challenge for, in that design profession as you're trained, because they're driven by the internal space, the function of the internal space. And so oftentimes what happens is the building as an individual unit becomes a determinant of urban space. Rather than, it's an entirely different design idea to think about urban space and how things go together. And the building is only one, in some ways, small piece of that. And so I think that the real question that's come down to me, it has in the last 30 years, who designs cities? Because cities actually, as we live and as we actually build them, it's a very collaborative thing. It isn't like historically or in the best places we all want to be and live in. Somebody drew that up, built it, and it just stayed that way forever. Just as you said, in what you've been seeing in Barcelona. And so the real question is who designs cities? And that's why I think some of what the work you're doing here, Felicity, is very interesting to me, because we started evolving to the point where artists were actually on the team, but they weren't designing plop art to go in a space that we design. They might design an urban space, the whole space, or be a part of the team in the space. And in that case, the idea that the image, whether it be a computer-generated image, or whether it be the picturesque movement It was an image, and Claude Lorraine
landscape, yeah.
did some painting of some sort of idealized city,
Yeah.
and then it was somehow copied out. Those images, I think, actually become very powerful. And when I see your work, it then raises a question, Felicity, when I see your work, I'm looking at it here, is that there's two ways that, for me, to, I think I have two kind of questions, or one question. One way I can look at this is a kind of dystopian image of cities. So it's a critique of our cities. And, you know, they're crumbling down, and they're sitting in some sort of chaos that I'm sure no architect or contemporary architect or urban designer would conceive of that. The other way to look at it is that this is actually a proposal. And it's a proposal by a city builder who is not an architect, or a city designer who is not an architect. And so my question is this a proposal or is it a critique?
That's a very nice question. I mean, where do I begin? I mean, I think absolutely the idea of this being a proposal by someone that's not an architect is a very fair thing to say. I think one aspect of my practice is, which I guess forms the background of this work, is that I make, as well as sort of installation works, I make I guess essentially photographic work or collages, two-dimensional pieces that become kind of speculative landscapes. So they become speculations of what might be. Yet they also sort of refer to the what has been as well, sort of looking back. So finding a way to, using photography as a way of kind of collapsing time, essentially, which is one of the attributes of the photographic that I enjoy using in my practice. So I think this, in terms of, is this a the question, is it a speculation or a proposal?
Is it a proposal or a critique?
A proposal or a critique, yeah. I mean, and I think I don't think it can be read as both of those things, of course, because in terms of proposal, I mean, I can't speculate what will happen. However, I can look back at the past and look into ideas and things that have happened in the past in order to kind of speculate or propose potential futures, I think. And perhaps this goes back to what David was saying earlier about how this looks like the 20s, or this looks like Metropolis, or kind of a set for something. It's the first thing that I thought of one of the first things I thought of when I came to this island, was that it was really Ballardian. It reminded me of kind of ballad novels. It made me think of ideas around community, which we've talked about, the potential collapse of that. What could happen. The sort of ruination, as those things start to sort of fall into ruin. So I think that it's neither one thing or the other. It can be read as a proposal, but it can also be read as sort of harking back and thinking of things, stories, whether they're fictional or true, things that have happened, that we might sort of draw upon in order to imagine the future of the built environment. I think one thing that you said, which I think I want to pick up on as well, which was really interesting, is how you were sort of present in that industry, in the shift between sort of drawing and digital design process, and suddenly you're like, but this is a different skill set. And I think that absolutely mimics sort of what happened in industry here. And I think about that in relationship to my own father, and him working in a factory, and being part of a generation of men that sort of were all kind of essentially lost their jobs around the same time because actually their skills were made obsolete. So that the processes or the lineage of the processes within architectural design actually, or within urban design, sort of mimic that of industry as well. And sort of we talked a bit earlier about the intangibility of some of these images as well, and actually it's the tangible and the intangible, and the technological and labour, and all of these kind of intersections that are informing this, that collision of timber, of surface, of physical production, of constructing and making, and the digital processes that go into constructing something like this. They're inhabiting the same space, so it can, I feel like yes, it can be a proposal, but it's also, I think, it's more complex than that, in the sense that it also speaks of a history or a lost history, or something that has been as well. Answers potentially your question.
just to follow up, I mean, what's interesting about the 20s, 20s modern, utopian modernism, is that so many of those proposals became their own critiques. Because all utopias have their own repress. So you can look at the plan for the radiant city from a perspective when it was first designed as some utopian thing. Now it looks like a critique. You can't look at a modernist, grand modernist city plan. No one should be allowed to design a city. That's probably a great lesson of modernism, isn't it? Are there any design cities that we're happy with?
That's an either-or question, isn't it? It's going to be a bit of both, I think.
Your last comment was great. The last sentence, what was the last?
I said, are there any design cities that we're happy with?
Well, I think there are many utopian and Renaissance city plans that we still think are perfectly wonderful. That we still think are perfectly wonderful, that were designed as a totality, as a utopian ideal plan.
Which one?
Well, like the Italian, or even Gothenburg, I'm thinking of, the sort of radial, sort of...
Very agnostic. I don't think anyone can do that to design a city. I mean, the interesting thing about the UK is that apart from the kind of post-war new towns, no developer's ever had a chance to do more than a few blocks. Blocks. I said blocks because you're Americans, but that's...
I mean, again,
it's kind of a redeeming...
Yeah, but what do you mean by designing a city? Simply designing a plan, or designing all the buildings as well, or... I mean, there...
The building is a total design, isn't it? It's a horrifying... The city is a total design. It seems like a horrifying idea.
But what about Haussmann and Cerda in Barcelona? I mean, and Manhattan, like, I don't know. I mean, I know where you're coming from, but you can't just push all of that away. We celebrate these cities, and, there were mistakes done, and yes. But at the same time, we also celebrate some order and, I don't know, beauty, whatever you want to call it. I don't know, like, I don't completely follow your argument. I think it needs to be a bit of both.
A bit of design and a bit of not.
Well, I think it should be like there can't be complete anarchy in a city in terms of building, because then developers would do also what they want. So I don't know. I'm trying to I think it needs to be a mixture of.
Well, yeah, I think maybe what you're talking about is actually what is happening here, in the sense that this thing it's called London City Island, and it is developed by one person. And I don't know enough about the processes that have gone into this, but presumably it's one team of architects. It's not kind of a bunch of different architectural firms all coming together and doing different things. Like this is a designed environment that is very much an island that is exclusive and its own city. I mean, and that's kind of why I mentioned Ballard, because it's it feels very much like that. It feels like high rise, and it feels like.
I would suggest that, in answer to your question, has there been a successful designed city? I would suggest that the answer is no, except for, then we have to ask the question, what is the design of the city? When we build an entire thing like this from scratch, and which we have the capability of doing nowadays, we didn't have as much of that ability in the 16th century. Things got built a little bit more smaller units. But when we build it all from as one image, which then we portray either as drawings or as artist renderings or as computer graphics, and then we freeze that in time and say, this is the way it has to stay. I can't think of any place that's been successful anywhere in the world. Because this gets back to what you're saying. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name.
Monica.
From Boston.
Yeah.
You're talking about the fact that the locals influence the people who live there start to change it. And if we build places that can't change, then we're bound to fail.
Yeah.
But there are many, many places where the thing that I refer to is what I call it's the urban framework. It's that first thing that goes down, and then all the different players come in and add pieces to it. And that's how so much of London grew. That's how some urban subdivisions work. And even, it's interesting because as we walked in here, in the States, many, many, many cities got built by speculators, as is done everywhere, came in the 19th century, and when land was free, basically, and they laid down a grid on the land, and they started selling property. They put a square in the middle, and very similar to the way some of the districts of London were subdivided. And that creates a certain kind of city. It creates a Manhattan-type grid. It creates, and there's a lot of advantages to that grid. But here, we walked onto the island from the station, and it's laid out with a series, there's no grid here, it's laid out almost like the kinds of spaces that you see in other parts of London. An entirely different underlying framework. And then all the architecture was designed at the same time, and it's all going up at the same time. But the framework is very different from a grid. And so then the question is, what's this place going to be allowed to do? Will people be allowed to hang their laundry on the wall? Will people be allowed to change the ground floor and put up different signs and different kinds of pubs and all the things, so that maybe in 75 years, this will be a great place, if in fact the users, as you say, are allowed to participate in it. Or if it always stays as a modernist drawing that was the way the CGI was done. And you have rules and you can't change.
I think that's, I mean, it's a really, I think your note about, how we kind of inhabit that space, or, will people be able to place laundry here? I think it's a really pertinent one, because that's when this place starts to become lived in, essentially. And I think perhaps that's maybe a good place to sort of tie things up as well. We can absolutely stick around and have a conversation on where of the time ticking on. But thank you all so much, and thank you for your really excellent questions as well, and sort of participating in the discussion.
One little thing I want to mention, which Gillian Rose told me as well to mention, and it's from her article, but if you look at CGIs, it always says CGI is indicative only. And maybe we should finish also with that little hope that it's indicative only.
Really, really.
I don't know. Sorry.
No, absolutely. It's a really nice point to end on.
Can I just say something? So first of all, thank you very much for this show. I love this work. I think it kind of binds what I really enjoy about architecture, but also CGI and digital and what we do together in general. I think this conversation here in general was really interesting. From a point of view of us as an organization, being moving here from happy to a very controlled environment of CTI. I think the role of art spaces, we also have artist studios on site, so I think the role of us coming here is to try to kind of make the 90 degrees corners kind of more rounded by being on site and create those tensions and kind of look at what architects, what developers, and what artists work and where these worlds become overlapping and these sort of things. And I think, in a way, when we launched the gallery here in 2017 with a Richard Wainscott installation, was 3 staircases. It's a very architectural installation, and that work was looking at the role, well, from our point of view, the role of galleries, not just display art, but become a space of conversations, an open discussion to bring different opinions, different people to come and work and kind of understand what it is to live together, what it is to become, how do you make a space, and how you can call it placemaking, or place shaping. There's so many now new words about it, but at the end of the day, it's about how people use the space. And the great group that I think is, I'm doing a PhD at the bottom of this now. There's architecture from non-architects, I don't remember the name of it, which is kind of very much about how things have become throughout history without having the skills, but having the eyes and having the imagination. I think this work in general, this work just opens up this idea of architecture without necessarily being an architect, but having those eyes and having those skills to look at this in a very critical way. I guess many think that kind of continues this narrative here. So thank you very much, Christy. I think
Thank you.
Thank you.